I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast, Rob. Today, we are looking at a poem by Li Bai that I translated.
Indeed. And in fact, when you sent it to me in the terms you used, my first response wasn't, sweet, Lee is translating a poem by Li Bai. My first response was, this is going to suck.
I think you said you can't do that.
I don't think I said that. That's what I was thinking for sure.
I translated a poem by Li Bai, and I proposed to do it in frat-boy-ese.
You were inspired by Maria Headley's, what we say, street slang translation of Beowulf, and how well that worked. And you thought, hey, why don't we do a purely contemporary version of a Li Bai poem? Now, my first thought was not, wow, that's a fresh and new idea. My first thought was, this is going to suck, because there's nothing about Li Bai that gives you the kind of room to work that a huge muscular action epic like Beowulf does. Now, to my surprise, when I read your translation, although it definitely does not sound like the Li Bai I hear in my head, I was like, this can actually be somewhat interesting. So let's actually start with this question, Lee. What did you start at point zero, read Maria Headley, and then go, wow, I should do that? Or were you already sort of thinking about doing this?
I was not thinking about doing this. It's actually something after I read, so Maria Devana Headley translated Beowulf. It got published, I think, last year. Really amazing translation. And I read her translation, and I was like, wow, that worked way better than I thought it was going to work. And then what happened is on December 31st, as midnight was approaching, I was hanging out with my mom and my dad and my daughter. My wife was back at home with the cat. I was in an Airbnb. I was the only one awake. I was having a beer, and I was translating this Li Bai poem. And in the middle of it, I realized my translation was so stale and so kind of like archaicized. It was trying to make Li Bai legitimate by translating him into a sort of Renaissance-y sounding, Shakespearean sounding poem. But Li Bai's just talking about getting drunk, right? Like we don't need to make Li Bai sound old in order to make him sound like he is a legitimate subject for poetry, right? Like we're beyond that now. That used to be the case. You used to have to translate Li Bai to sound like Shakespeare because Westerners did not think that Chinese poetry was the equivalent. I think we've gotten beyond that. I hope we've gotten beyond that. I certainly believe the listeners of our podcast are way beyond that stage. And so I was like, why don't we just translate him in a way that would be much more comprehensible to contemporary readers? And this is a poem about getting totally wasted. This is a frat boy poem. Li Bai is the ultimate frat boy.
And it's still a work in progress. I should point this out. It's not like you've published it or anything yet, which is kind of a new thing for us. We don't usually podcast on stuff that isn't finished yet. It's a fascinating question, because one of the things that can sometimes mess with readers of Chinese poetry for the first time is the thought that this doesn't really feel like poetry, right? When I teach Dufu to students, for example, if I just give them the English translation, particularly some of the sort of prose poetry versions, which are my favorites personally, think of David Hawkes, for example. If I don't preface it by saying, hey, this is a poem, 9 times out of 10 they read it and they're like, it's nice. I don't really see why we're studying this, right? It's not until you break down all the ins and outs and the complexities of the Chinese prosody that people go, oh wow, that's amazing. Right now, I only bring that up because it would not necessarily occur to the average translator to go, hey, the thing is, Chinese poetry isn't Western poetry. It doesn't have to be, like you mentioned, Shakespeare. It doesn't have to be quote unquote high art. It could just be poetry. It could just be something that people read.
This is high art, but it's also about getting drunk, and so it has this kind of element of very low art. And Li Bai, he was once a real human being. He's not he wasn't born a god of poetry. He was just a guy who liked to hang out and drink copious amounts. And all of these people drank lots. I was translating, Du Fu has this reputation of being this austere Confucian poet who always follows the ritual proprietary rules. But I was translating a poem of his a couple of days ago. It's called Drunk. I fell off my horse, and my friends came bringing me alcohol to check on. They came to check on me, bringing me alcohol. It, it's very much an alcohol-soaked culture.
And in fact, what's interesting is that, and I'm going to go ahead and title/name drop this work because everyone should read it if you're interested in this. Drunk in China by Derek Sandhaus talks about the fact that to a great extent, alcohol predates Chinese culture, Chinese civilization at all. It even predates organized agriculture, systematic agriculture. The earliest examples of alcohol that we know of come from China. Something like 10,000 years ago, I think. So people were drinking in China before there was anything like an organized civilization in China.
Rob, to put that another way, in the words of an American writer who you really like, William Faulkner, he said civilization began with distillation. I think you can say that that's true of Chinese civilization as well. Without alcohol, it's not really civilization.
Well, and it's actually, and again, this is, I don't want to get us into the weeds, but I think this is interesting, so I'm going to throw it out there. One of the newer ideas is that drinking predates agriculture and may even have been one of the engines behind agriculture because alcohol can be made without any technique at all. A piece of fruit falls off a tree, cracks open, is exposed to some of the local wild things floating in the air, ferments. That's it. Monkeys can get drunk, right? Anyway, one of the ideas behind agriculture is that people started figuring out, hey, you know what? This stuff is awesome. You know what'd be great is if we had enough stuff to make a lot of it, let's grow it. Now, what does all that have to do with Li Bai? And specifically your translation of Li Bai? What it has to do with it is that alcohol in Chinese poetry is both highbrow and lowbrow at the same time. You can read translations of Li Bai drinking as a refined sort of a poet drinking alcohol and writing refined poetry, or you can read it as something different, which is just him getting hammered.
I think we should read this poem as both him getting hammered and him finding in alcohol some sort of solace for how for the problems of the world. And that's not, alcohol becomes this way to complain about greater issues. Is it okay, Rob, if I just read the poem, my translation?
Go for it.
So the poem, we're going to post it on the website. So please take a look at the website and let us know what you think of the translation. I titled my translation, Let's Party, and here it goes. The yellow river only flows one way, rushing towards the sea, never turning back. Can you not see me in the big hall, reflected in the blinged-out mirror, with my hair turned white? It is as if my once jet-black hair has, late in life, become like a cloud. When people are happy, they should party hard. Don't let the gold cup remain empty when facing the moon. Barbecue that lamb, slaughter that cow. This is a party. We ought to drink 300 cups of this, and we don't cuss on the podcast, so I'm not going to say that word. 春泉缘木球. Let's drink, let's party, drink nonstop. Sing a song with me, and as I sing, y'all listen up. Spending cash, having parties, that's something that everybody does, but me, I'm ready to go on a binge and never sober up. From back in the day, all the holy saints were lonely and shunned. Only the boozers stay famous. In olden times, Cao Zhi partied it up with feast at Pingle, drinking stuff that was worth thousands as much as he liked. Man, why do you say you are low on cash? For I should be the one to buy you a beer and share some of it with you. The dappled mane, the fur coat, call the bartender and get them to bring out some more booze. For this is the way we will distract ourselves from the worries of the ages.
All right, Lee. I got to throw you this question, and this is kind of unfair because this is something we already agreed was a difficult thing, but I'm going to throw it out to you anyway. Your point in translating this was sort of to present a more contemporary version of the poem, but you're still trying to write quote-unquote poetry. There are lines where it's like, my jet black hair has grown white. Something like that. I have to go back and look at the copy again. That's clearly not street level speech, right? Other lines are, right? Only the boozers stay famous. Cool, right? That sounds like something you'd hear in a country music song or some hip hop tracks, whatever. So why are you hedging? Why are you still trying to hold on to sort of quote-unquote high culture, high poetry? Why not just put all your chips on the table and just make this thing purely colloquial?
It's really hard to do. I struggled to do that. It's one of those things that you're trained to think of poetry as purely elite language at an elite register, at a very high social register. And so doing so was really hard. Also, that line that you mentioned, my once jet black hair has late in life become like a cloud. I don't know how I can translate that into contemporary vernacular, either a kind of country-ish contemporary vernacular or a rap-ish contemporary vernacular with, it's very hard to do and stay faithful to Li Bai. A lot of these lines, I am 100% completely faithful to Li Bai, right? Like that line from back in the day, all the holy saints were lonely and shunned, only the boozers stay famous. That's a really good translation. That's a very faithful translation of Li Bai.
Except for the word booze.
No, that's perfectly good for that word.
I've always, you tend to love to use the word booze when you translate Li Bai, and booze always sounds to me like somebody's crawling through the gutter talking about alcohol, and that's definitely not what Li Bai was drinking. Li Bai was probably drinking some version of Huangjiu, not gut rot from the local village.
So the actual Chinese is just yinzhi, which literally means the one who drinks or drinker. And clearly he's referencing alcohol here. So I think boozer is a perfectly acceptable and faithful translation. I mean, your hang-ups aside, I think those are personal ones, and you should talk with your psychiatrist about those. But in terms of like the faithfulness to the Chinese, it's fine. I don't think that he was being that refined when he says, I want to get so drunk that I never sober up. That's he's not talking about something that's refined, is he, Rob?
Not necessarily, although the language he was using was certainly refined.
Sure.
I mean, in terms of the poetic meter, the lines, and all that. But you're clearly not translating it to sound refined.
I mean, it's hard to...
Which takes us back to the question, right? Because if you're... This is one of the classic conundrums of translation, right? Do you translate just the way you hear it in your head? Do you have to translate so that it is character by character or line by line faithful to the poem? Or can you just have some fun with it and, like the line about your jet black hair, why not just alter that completely so you get the same idea but not remotely the same character order?
I don't feel super comfortable altering Li Bai's original meaning that much. I tried with this poem to stay faithful to it in my translation.
It's interesting because for many, the idea of making it a purely contemporary poem would be unfaithful because Li Bai's poetry wasn't something that somebody in a village could just pick up and read in Tang Dynasty China. It was not meant for, he was writing originally in any way for the emperor, for the literati. He wasn't writing for the dude in the street. And yet you're writing for the dude in the street.
He's writing for the dude in the bar here. His friends are very educated and they're the ones who are reading this, but he is definitely writing for very well-educated alcoholics. So I think...
Why do you say that?
He's praising alcohol. These poems were composed sitting around with people drinking. I don't know the specific composition of this poem or when it was actually written, but drinking went hand in hand with poetry in Tang literati culture. So I would expect that he's hanging out with some poets and getting very, very wasted while composing this poem.
Right. Well, the question would be, of course, for whom was he writing? Because you already mentioned intelligent literati sitting around drinking. They're not drinking with farmers and laborers. They're drinking with their own sort and writing for their own sort. And yet you're jumping over the... Now, I'm going to preface this by saying I like a lot of what's going on in this translation. This is going to sound like I'm criticizing it. I like it. But you're still trying to jump ranks, right? Like, this is written for the literati, but I'm translating it for people who are definitely not the literati.
I'm translating it for a contemporary audience. I don't think there is a language in contemporary English. Like, Rob, I think you're trying to invent a language, right? There is no kind of language that's the equivalent of Tang Dynasty. And Rob, as a comparatist, you know better than I do that all translations are a form of like the translator is a traitor. That's an Italian trope.
Right.
The words in Italian actually are almost the same. So I think that the expectation that this poem would somehow like fit into a register similar to that in Tang China is just, it's completely bonkers because there is no equivalent.
Absolutely. Which is, again, my original question, why are you still trying to do it? Why not just go ahead, roll the dice, and say, instead of saying, my once jet black hair, say something like, my black hair is all gray. Something like that. Anyway, there's lots of ways to render that in a purely contemporary register that doesn't even take into account the word order, because as a good comparatist, maybe as a bad comparatist, I don't know, I'm not real hung up on fidelity. My biggest thing is, can you get people interested in the writer? And what interests me about your translation is that I think when done well, this contemporary voice could really wake people up to, oh wow, Li Bai was really, look what he's doing here. He's kind of a partier. What's going on here? Like you mentioned in an email, I think originally, a lot of the existing translations of Li Bai like to emphasize the brilliant artistic literati style that he was using, while somehow forgetting that he was still partying pretty hard, right? Like, there's an angle of this to be used, and like with that Headley translation of Beowulf, if you just go ahead and put all your chips on one side of the table and say, this is not going to be the Li Bai you've ever read before, I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, part of that is just I'm struggling to find that voice, but I accept your criticism. But I also want to point out you're bringing up something interesting. You know, all of the other translations of Li Bai have been, I'm just going to say it, kind of stuffy. They've been done mostly by academics. And, you know, I say that as an academic.
Yeah.
I shouldn't throw those stones in glass houses. But there is this kind of need to make him stuffy and sound kind of highfalutin and artistic. And in voice, I didn't do that, but I struggled because this poem, it has an important message. It's not just about getting wasted. It's about time. And he feels like Li Bai, the poet, he's saying that he is wasting time. That those first two lines, I guess first four lines in my English translation, are about time going only one direction and him getting old. And what he's doing by being drunk is not just, you know, getting wasted, but he's trying to forget that this life is passing him by. It's a meditation on the effervescentness of life, how quickly it slips away from us, and how much we feel unaccomplished as we get older. You know, that line about the jet black hair becoming white, he's talking, I translated it as, can you not see me in the big hall, reflected in the blinged out mirrors with my hair turned white? It is as if my once jet black hair has late in life become like a cloud. You know, he's meditating on whether or not becoming an official, that is, getting a real job, as we would put it in today's language, whether or not that's a complete waste. You know, everybody in the Tang Dynasty wants to get one of those positions with the government. It's the end-all, be-all of what you needed to do to be considered a success. You know, like get that big job with the big house. Yeah, I mean, we could come up with some rock songs that are about this. Rob, I would say maybe something from the band Everclear.
There's a ton of stuff. Are you kidding me? This is. You could take most of the country music industry and just go with that.
But he's kind of rejecting that, and his embrace of drunkenness is a rejection of the normative value, the like doing things the way that mom and dad want you to do it. He's not going to do that. He's not going to get the government job. He's not going to hang out in the big halls with the fancy mirrors. He's going to just hang out and get drunk. That's what this whole poem is about. He's distracting himself from the fact that a lot of people end up wasting their lives chasing after things that aren't all that important, but he's just going to be happy. He's just going to have fun. But it is an empty kind of fun, because I don't think he's finding happiness, but he's also acknowledging that those folks who chase after the big job aren't happy either.
Now, here's what's interesting about that. Everything you just said in terms of sentiment is, as you mentioned, something I guarantee I've heard in 100 songs from various pop industries, right? Country music, rock music, whatever. The real difficulty with translating Li Bai, and for that matter, any poet from his era, is that there's an element of the everyday about him. Let's just have a drink, right? That's something just about anyone can identify with, just about any level of society. But the poetry that he writes is drawing off of a tradition that definitely not everyone can use. So there's this fascinating blend of very approachable everyday sentiments. Life is fleeting. Life is passing us by. Why are we going for these positions? Why are we doing these things? Let's have a drink and maybe not sign off on all the things where we've been told to do, etc. But he's saying it in a way that is extremely, at times at least, sophisticated. So in translating it, you've got to somehow kind of keep both in there, or else it does just sound like a country music song or a rap song or a rock song, right? Now, you're trying to walk this line, which I think you should, between the two, right? You don't want it to be 100% this or 100% that. And I think that's in some way puts you in the same camp as a lot of translators of Li Bai. Which version are we going to present here? Like, are we going to lean into the high culture academic stuff, or are we going to lean more into the we're drinking booze with our friends stuff? Because they're both there, and they're extremely hard to render in a way that just perfectly blends the two. At least that's my take on it.
Rob, I think you're right. It's kind of a struggle to walk the line, as Johnny Cash would say. I don't know if I did it well. We're going to put this translation, both the original Chinese and my translation, onto the website, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. Please go check it out. Let us know what you think of the translation. And Rob, if they want to reach out to us, how should they do that?
Look us up at Twitter, ChinLitPod, Patreon, of course, Chinese Literature Podcast. And, of course, as Lee mentioned, the email, ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. Do let us know what you think of the translation. We're also very interested to hear what you have to think about a much more colloquial contemporary translation of Li Bai. Is it something that just you can't stand, it drives you crazy? If so, why? Or is it something that really makes you excited, and if so, why?
Rob, I think that's a great place to end it. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.